So rapid population growth, leading to what?
Population demand for food or something like that.
Because now we have a lot of pollution of manufacturers, so more pollution than there was before.
Okay, so from factories, pollution like we burn something, yeah, like fossil fuels, and then we have increase in, for example, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Okay. Because when you look at this graph here, I mean, this is not now going hundreds of thousand years back in time, but you see that scientists try to actually show the difference between, let's say, changes naturally. Yeah, we have here starting from 1900. We have here natural factors only. Yeah, now focusing only on global temperature change. And you see that, of course, you have this variability. And you see here in this darker blue, we have natural and human factors. And starting from 1900, you see that always these natural and human factors, they basically match each other. But then when you look here from the mid-century, last century, then you see there's this gap. Yeah, when you look at only natural factors, then you look here also on the human factors and of the observed trend. And this is basically now focusing on increase in temperature. And what did we say does lead to also this increase in temperature, to this rapid increase? And we said already, like this, because of factories, there are a lot of burning, so maybe increase in pollution, but what about also other things which could contribute also to this warming?
I guess World War II had an effect on the world climate because it's a little bit increasing and there's a decreasing around 1960 because of
the World War II was here, yeah? 39 to 45. Here? Yeah. Okay. What could be a reason?
Because of like bombings and also because of using several atomic bombs. I would guess. Manufacturing.
In general, especially the warming, it is because of like an increase of this greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And we said already that on the one hand we have these factories, and so when we burn fossil fuel, then we have an increase in CO2, this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We also have other sources actually for greenhouse gases. I mean, you also see here, for example, that when we burn down forests, deforestate, because forests are carbon sinks, so they sequester carbon. When you burn them, then they release again the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We also have from cars, that they release a lot of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere, but we also have from livestock, for example. What is the greenhouse gas related to livestock? Yeah, so basically this greenhouse effect, even though maybe it mentions in the framework of this whole climate change discussion as a negative connotation, that always these greenhouse gases and increasing emissions are causing and also global warming. But when we go like a step back, and also what was just mentioned by Amadeus, in general, this greenhouse effect we have on the Earth, it's basically also the reason why we can live here actually on this planet. Because actually it balances also the the temperature on our planet. And without this greenhouse effect, we couldn't live here actually. And you already mentioned a little bit that it depends actually on the sun. Yeah? So we have it's basically, it's a balance between sun radiation entering, also our atmosphere, and also then leaving the atmosphere. So here you have the sun, and you have like the solar radiation, shortwave radiation. It enters our atmosphere, and it, so to say, it hits the surface. Yes. So on the one hand, you have this shortwave radiation coming from the sun, and there are actually two possibilities, or actually three. So it enters the atmosphere when you have like a lot of clouds, because they have like also this wide surface. They could be directly reflected back into the system. Or it could also be directly reflected back when it hits the Earth's surface. Yeah? For example, when you have glaciers, yeah, it's also like a wide surface. So it could be directly reflected back. But there could be also, and this is actually now the main thing, that solar radiation gets absorbed by the surfaces. And with this absorption, then the Earth's surface heats up. And when it heats up, then also it releases also radiation, but it is then a long wave radiation, basically infrared radiation. This is what you see here. So when it gets absorbed, the Earth heats up and releases then energy, which reflects back. And then you have actually these greenhouse gases come into play. Because these greenhouse gases like CO2, CH4, they are here in our atmosphere. And they cannot absorb like this shortwave radiation from the sun. But they actually absorb then the heat or the radiation, which has been absorbed and reflected then from the Earth. So basically, then these greenhouse gases, they function also like a blanket, because they absorb then the energy coming back from the Earth, and then also absorb them and reflect it back. So that it's basically like a little bit like a ping pong also within this atmosphere. Is this clear? Yeah, so basically, when we put more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it actually leads to that the Earth more and more heats up. I mean, I showed you already in the very first lecture we had that these are the projections for the future. They have taken the baseline from 1986 to 2005, and when we consider different scenarios of how much we actually further emit into the atmosphere, then you see how the temperature will change. And if we try to manage to emit or decrease our greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, then we still will experience warming, basically all over the world. In some parts maybe less intense, but if we really continue like this, then our Earth will heat up. Yeah? You see even like spots projected, I mean of course this is for the end of the century, but really severe, like 7, 8, 9 degrees increase of this global average temperature. What were other like effects of this very rapid climate change? Not only the global warming, but what other effects we said? I mean, you already mentioned that there's also more extreme events, maybe, more natural hazards. So, going back to the initial question, basically when I said, okay, climate change naturally has changed always, so what is now the issue? But we think we agree now that it's not now natural change, it's really human-driven change, and that impacts are real and somehow we have to deal with it also. Yeah? And I showed you also last time this graph about the index of vulnerability to climate change. I mentioned that especially here Central Asian region, the high mountains region especially, is very vulnerable to climate change. And I showed you this graph where you see basically Tajikistan was the most vulnerable region. You also see Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan.
Is it around the globe?
I think they only looked at the Central Asian region and Eastern Europe. Yes, it's not the whole world in this graph. Do you remember what was behind this vulnerability index? We talked about different. Yes, so this was behind. So we had like the factors behind vulnerability. And you already mentioned it, so it consists of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And here again is are the definitions. Yeah? So exposure, the degree to which something experiences a climate-related hazard. Sensitivity, degree of impact that a hazard can have on something. And then adaptive capacity, that's the ability to proactively modify conditions to reduce vulnerability.
Reaction of the second one.
So exposure, you said it's like about the punches, yeah?
Yeah.
So the basic number of times you are punched.
Yeah.
Sensitivity was
How fast you are punched?
how fast. So when you are punched, does it hurt actually? How much does it hurt? Yeah? And then adaptive capacity was
It's how much
how quickly you can move out of the way. Very good. And I just wanted to discuss with you now and repeat a little bit these three factors. So we think about now, so when you drive a car, for example, you're vulnerable to car accidents. So wearing a seatbelt, what does it actually affect? Can you reduce your exposure? Can you reduce your sensitivity? Or you increase your adaptive capacity when wearing a seatbelt while driving a car? Yes. I mean, I even had my own experience with this. Yeah, I was in a car accident, and if I wouldn't have had a seatbelt, I might have been dead. So in this case, actually, it reduces your sensitivity. You're still exposed, but it doesn't hurt you so much, hopefully, depending on the car accident. What about the next one? Relocating a coastal village. I mean, sensitivity, of course, you're still exposed to the drought, yeah, because you still have your fields in this area. When the drought will happen, but you will be compensated financially, that it doesn't hurt so much. For decreasing sensitivity. Was that clear or further questions? And I mean, we talked about climate change, also the effects of climate change. So we have change in mean global temperature, changes in regional temperature, also rainfall, pressure, and so on. And we have, on the one hand, the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, which lead to this climate change. And then climate change is happening, so we definitely have climate change impacts. And then we have actually these two main concepts, mitigation and adaptation. Both concepts, they try to reduce the risk in general to climate change. But then we have mitigation, which is more on this side, so really to try to limit the changes in climate. And this is about reducing emissions, for example. Yeah. And then we have adaptation on the other side, because climate change the impacts are already happening, we have to deal with them. So we actually also have to proactively do something and try to reduce our vulnerability to these climate change impacts. And they actually, and we will come back to this also later, they are complementary strategies. You can't really focus on one or the other, because both is happening and we have to deal with it. And as I said, mitigation is really it focuses on reducing and avoiding new greenhouse gas emissions. And I will show you later also some examples, and we'll also talk a little bit more about the potential also, for example, like a small country like Kyrgyzstan, what can they do about mitigation, even though they don't really emit a lot. But before this, I would like to do a small game with you. Because as you remember, there was in 2015 there was the Paris Agreement, and actually all the countries they reached a historic agreement, and they aim to move to a more low carbon society and try to reduce our emissions and try to hold the increase of the global average temperature below 2 degrees. And I need now 8 volunteers, because I would like to play with you that you try now to lower our emissions with this ruler here. So 8 people I need, 8 volunteers, also to get you more active here. And now I put actually, this is the ruler, and it's representing like the level of the CO2 we have at the moment. And you as a group, you have now the task to bring down the level of CO2 emissions actually to 0, so to bring the ruler down to the floor. Yeah?
Together.
Together, yes. That's why you have really 4 facing 4, so really, and then going close together. And then I will lie the ruler on your index fingers. And the rules are that all of you is not allowed to lose touch of this ruler at any time. Yeah? And then when I say go, then you have to bring it down. As soon as one of you will lose touch of the ruler, then we have to start all over again. And you can talk, if you want, we can also come up with some ideas.
About touching the index. Oh wow.
Держи. Ниже, чуть-чуть правее.
We can do it.
Just be careful of the European.
Don't force it.
Чуть-чуть пониже.
No, I don't touch it.
Пониже, давай, ну ты можешь.
Да, ты можешь.
Держи.
You have to put it on the floor. But actually you're already really good.
No.
Не ставь. Don't.
So like
Are you ready?
slow.
Are you ready? Do like this.
It's the most talented of the
Yeah,
groups.
really.
Slow.
It's not always about only carbon. So the one industries, of course, when you look at power plants, they burn these fossil fuels. But then also, of course, industries when they produce something. So, and then, for example, all this waste they also produce. This could also then go back into the negative cycle, so to say. What do you want to add? And then what we already mentioned, so we also have, or we can also look at the land use sectors. Yeah? For example, agriculture. We mentioned already this methane produced by livestock. And for example, also in Kyrgyzstan, we have millions of sheep and cows running around, but also other cultivation techniques, for example, rice. And of course, what was just mentioned by Amadeus, that forests are actually a very important carbon sink, which could sequester carbon. So focusing on afforestation, reforestation, and in general reduce this whole deforestation. I showed you already in this figure that actually mitigation and adaptation, they are complementary strategies. And this actually because, the goal of mitigation, so to say, is we try to reduce our emissions, and with this also slow the rate of global warming and minimize the extent of climate change. But, of course, with these efforts, we cannot stop or reverse climate change. That's why, or actually the reason behind is, we already started to emit these greenhouse gases, or the vast amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And even if we would stop now immediately, they would be still in the atmosphere for a longer period of time. This actually shows here. When you look at carbon dioxide, CO2, there's a lifetime in the atmosphere about 200 years. Methane only 12 years, but then you also have other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, 114 years, and even when you look at other greenhouse gases like carbon, terafluoride, it stays 50,000 years into the atmosphere. And this is actually why, even if we would stop today, the Earth is still committed to warming, even if we manage to mitigate. That's why we also have to adapt, because these climate change impacts, they are present, they are real, and they will continue also. That's why the second concept is adaptation. So actions to reduce our vulnerability to changes in climate and to the impacts or harm from these hazards. This is the second concept. And we will only shortly touch it now because on Thursday I would like to basically dedicate the whole seminar also about adaptation and their special approach called ecosystem-based adaptation. So to highlight once more, we need both mitigation and adaptation. And also mitigation gives us more time to adapt. So what are adaptation options? Shortly. That people start to adapt. For example, when there's drought conditions, and they are dependent on this agricultural activities, maybe they can switch to more drought-resistant plants or use other crop type, for example. So here we have, for example, related to water, especially also here the region as there's glacier melting, and we do not really know or we are sure that we do not have always plentiful of water, so that we could focus on better water storage or using more efficient water management techniques. Also focus on rainwater harvesting. And agriculture, as I already mentioned, so adjustment of planting dates and crop variety, crop relocation also. And but also related to human health, for example, or even tourism. But here, here's written, for example, shifting ski slopes to higher altitudes and glaciers, or even artificial snowmaking, that the people still can continue to go skiing even though there might be not enough snow. What do you think about artificial snowmaking? Is it really a good adaptation option? So you would need a lot of resources and also resource inputs like energy, which might be even a need to maladaptation somewhere else. Okay, as we still have 5 minutes left, we wanted to show you a short, it's a talk, it's a presentation basically, by the Prime Minister of Bhutan, because we thought maybe it's also difficult to understand a little bit when you look at Kyrgyzstan as this rather small country, not really contributing a lot to greenhouse gas emissions in the world, but also, so what can they actually do in the framework of mitigation and adaptation? And then we thought we'd show you a short talk from the Prime Minister of Bhutan.
72% of my country is under forest cover. Our constitution demands that a minimum of 60% of Bhutan's total land shall remain under forest cover for all time. Our constitution, this constitution, imposes forest cover on us. Incidentally, our king used this constitution to impose democracy on us. You see, we, the people, didn't want democracy. We didn't ask for it. We didn't demand it. And we certainly didn't fight for it. Instead, our king imposed democracy on us by insisting that he include it in the constitution. But he went further. He included provisions in the constitution that empower the people to impeach their kings, and included provisions in here that require all our kings to retire at the age of 65. Fact is, we already have a king in retirement. Our previous king, the Great Fourth, retired 10 years ago at the peak of his popularity. He was all of 51 years at that time. So as I was saying, 72% of our country is under forest cover. And all that forest is pristine. That's why we are one of the few remaining global biodiversity hotspots in the world. And that's why we are a carbon neutral country. In a world that is threatened with climate change, we are a carbon neutral country. Turns out it's a big deal. Of the 200 odd countries in the world today, it looks like we are the only one that's carbon neutral. Actually, that's not quite accurate. Bhutan is not carbon neutral. Bhutan is carbon negative. Our entire country generates 2.2 million tons of carbon dioxide. But our forests, they sequester more than 3 times that amount. So we are a net carbon sink for more than 4 million tons of carbon dioxide each year. But that's not all. We export most of the renewable electricity we generate from our fast-flowing rivers. So today, the clean energy that we export offsets about 6 million tons of carbon dioxide in our neighborhood. By 2020, we'll be exporting enough electricity to offset 17 million tons of carbon dioxide. And if we were to harness even half our hydropower potential, and that's exactly what we're working at, the clean, green energy that we export would offset something like 50 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. That is more CO2 than what the entire city of New York generates in 1 year. So inside our country, we are a net carbon sink. Outside, we are offsetting carbon. And this is important stuff. You see, the world is getting warmer. And climate change is a reality. Climate change is affecting my country. Our glaciers are melting, causing flash floods and landslides, which in turn are causing disaster and widespread destruction in our country. I was at that lake recently. It's stunning. That's how it looked 10 years ago. And that's how it looked 20 years ago. Just 20 years ago, that lake didn't exist. It was a solid glacier. A few years ago, a similar lake breached its dams and wreaked havoc in the valleys below. That destruction was caused by one glacial lake. We have 2,700 of them to contend with. The point is this: my country and my people have done nothing to contribute to global warming. But we are already bearing the brunt of its consequences. And for a small, poor country, one that is landlocked and mountainous, it is very difficult. But we are not going to sit on our hands doing nothing. We will fight climate change. That's why we have promised to remain carbon neutral. We first made this promise in 2009 during COP15 in Copenhagen. But nobody noticed. Governments were so busy arguing with one another and blaming each other for causing climate change that when a small country raised our hands and announced, "We promise to remain carbon neutral for all time," nobody heard us. Nobody cared. Last December in Paris, at COP21, we reiterated our promise to remain carbon neutral for all time to come.
Right, so I feel like the same can be true here in Kyrgyzstan. Even though Kyrgyzstan is not a big country, bigger than Bhutan, but it's not a big country. Even though we don't have a lot of resources, mostly we have water, sheep, and we do have gold. We don't have a lot of resources here, but we can still do something. Right? We have lots of open land that we can do afforestation on, reforestation on. We can produce these carbon sinks. It is a possibility for Kyrgyzstan to do something.
So that's it for today.